Welcome, everybody, to Recruit, Hire, Lead to Retain. I'm your host, Deborah Reynolds, owner of About Face Image Consulting, leadership coach, image mindset, and transformation expert. And my co host is recruiting and hiring expert, owner of Best Culture Solutions, Tim Dick. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, good morning. Good to be back. How are
Good
you?
morning. Hey, I know that our audience, if they're Canadian, they've obviously had hopefully an amazing Thanksgiving. We were all blessed, enjoyed turkey early. And to our American audience, we know yours is coming up in November. How was your Thanksgiving, Tim?
Yeah, I'm still it's been an interesting week because I'm still coming out of it, I think, a little bit. So it was great. No complaints. And yeah, I mean, there's lots to be thankful for every day, but it's nice to take time to celebrate too on that specific day. So
Yeah. You
yeah.
know, from a gratitude point of view, we've got a really interesting topic, and that is around the concept of quiet quitting
Hmm.
and quiet firing.
Mhm.
Because a lot of organizations do things in a very quiet way. A lot of employees do things in a very quiet way and just kind of disappear. So I know we have some really interesting things to talk about today. And of course, we missed our session last time
We did.
because you actually had to deal with an emergency termination. So
That's
let's,
right.
you know what, share some of your concepts and ideas around this happening that we see in the workplace environment.
Yeah, that's a good. Thank you. Yeah, and it's funny because I've heard a lot of different definitions of quiet quitting. The first one that I heard was the concept that people just aren't responding to emails, after work hours anymore. They're not putting in hours, outside of regular hours because they're burning out and they realize that, um, they can't sustain that. And so for a lot of people, at least the first definition that I heard of quiet quitting, it was the concept of no longer putting in unreasonable amounts of hours, on top of what you already do just to try to keep things going. And people were just beginning to turn off their phones and their computers when it was time. That actually isn't the worst thing that I've heard of. But I've also since heard of another one where another form of quiet quitting or another interpretation or definition of it where people aren't putting in an effort while they're on the job either, like during their regular hours, or they're refusing to do things while they're there, just for the sake of, just to not do it because they don't want to do it anymore. And that's been another definition I've heard of quiet quitting. So what's some of the ones that you've heard?
You know, obviously the first thing that comes to mind when people are discussing the quiet quitting element
Yeah.
is leaving the job and not showing up. So
Yeah.
they've been hired, they're working in the job, and then one day they just disappear. They're just
Right.
not showing up
Another
at
version.
all. And
Yeah.
there's no explanation or reason for it. And even their colleagues are kind of like, what happened to this person?
Yeah. Where'd
Um,
they go?
and they've just thought, you know what, I just don't want this job anymore, but they tell no one, they just disappear and they're gone. But I love the concept of what you're saying, how people do the quiet quitting,
Yeah.
the end of the work shift, which is the typical work day, could be 4 p.m., 5 p.m.
Yeah.
That's
That's
it. Their
nice.
phones go off, they respond, not at all. And they're waiting until the next morning that comes in. So they may actually, from a human resources point of view, um, they may, I wouldn't say put in a false telephone number for what their home phone number is, but they actually put in something in terms of a call display and they
Right.
will not respond to any phone calls from a workplace environment.
Yeah, you know what? And at first, when I heard some of those definitions kind of around, just having limits and knowing when to turn it off if it's not an emergency and stuff like that, I kind of thought, well, that's good. I don't think anything is quitting there. That sounds like, boundary setting to me. And that
Yeah.
sounded okay to me. Some of the other stuff I worry a little bit more about. Um, but yeah, to me, like that actually sounded like not such a bad thing, to be honest.
There is sometimes an expectation on the managerial level and
Yeah.
higher that they will work a lot of extra hours and they actually won't get paid for it. So I don't know what it's like in the US per se. I mean, I know with some companies when I'm coaching and I'm working with some executives in companies how they're handling things, but there is an expectation that people will put in a lot more hours,
Sure.
and they're expected to show up and they're expected to respond because if a workplace environment is very remote,
Yeah.
and you have employees from all over the globe.
Yeah.
You've got the CEO and some senior managers that are working these long hours, and they are
It can
reaching out
happen.
to people and expecting a response right away. And it could be wee hours of the morning and late at night.
Totally. Well, and you're very right about that too, Deb. And I think, yeah, like, but one of the things I've noticed around that, even if you do have an international workplace, there typically always seems to be some opportunity for overlap if you look for it to actually make sure you're collaborating with people at a time. And so I think what happens is it's kind of like what you say, it's almost like an unspoken expectation.
Right.
Sometimes, to be honest, sometimes some people bring it on themselves. Like if I can say, like, it isn't because the boss has told them to do it or created that expectation, but they feel like within themselves they have to do it, right? Or that they want to do it, or they're worried about getting deadlines done on time. I know sometimes, even as a business owner, I will do it on occasion, just because I feel like I need to for this project, and that's okay. But it's a little bit different when you're doing it for yourself than when somebody else compels you to, right? And the mindset around that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in a former career, when
Right.
I was a government worker, I loved certain aspects of the job, and
Right.
my partner and I would work one day on a weekend, unpaid overtime, simply because we love to do the job. But what that does is it actually skews expectations and, of course, statistics if they're looking at the performance of a unit or a team and how they perform, or an individual and how they perform. So, but there was, I guess, underlying expectations for myself. I was kind of hoping maybe I would be noticed in a
Right.
very specific way.
Yeah.
And I would also be considered for promotions and those sorts of things. So I was putting in the additional time. The expectations didn't pan out quite the way that I had hoped. However, I mean, I still loved the job. It was amazing in what I was doing. So a lot of it was doing it just for the sheer joy of it.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny you say about the expectations not panning out. Um, because a lot of times I find that when people do these things and they're hoping that it can demonstrate, an or provide an opportunity to get ahead or promote or something like that, it doesn't always quite go how we hope, does it?
No, absolutely
So
not.
I always encourage people, and when we're young and we're younger, we do it, without that experience of seeing that it doesn't always work out that way. But I always warn people. I say, well, like don't do it if you're hoping for, because you might not get what you hope for, right? And but it happens. It happens. People do things for all the right and best intentions, and it just doesn't always work out how we hoped, right?
Yeah, and it depends on where you're starting this habit and creating it. If you do not have a great deal of leadership responsibility and you get
Yeah.
into the habit of doing it, when you step into a leadership position,
Yeah.
then again you kind of have the sense of it's expected and I need to do
Sure.
this without actually being articulated by senior management. So,
That's
but
right.
then you spiral, and then you're getting overwhelmed and exhausted and tired because you've got a lot of people coming at you, and you're in that sandwich element where you're receiving or getting a lot of information from the top coming down to you, and then you have all this information coming to you from your employees below you up
Mm,
to you, and you feel like you're being squashed in this process,
that's
and
right.
it could be pretty exhausting.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? And I mean, I would be really surprised if anybody who may be listening or watching today hasn't been through that, because everybody's done it at some point, right? Everybody has been there, so it's a really common phenomenon.
I
Yeah.
think part of the contract too, Tim, when you're working with a company, is
Right.
the clear expectations of going, what are the work hours?
Yeah.
What are you expecting me? Even before you sign your contract, you
Yeah.
need to know what are the hours? What do I need to put in? What am I being paid? Is there an expectation for overtime? Can I expect to be paid overtime when I'm working overtime? How does it work? Do I need permission first? Do I just submit my hours? All of that needs to be hashed out and clarified first, because really need to understand that corporate environment.
Yeah, 1,000%. You're very right about that. Yeah, you're very right about that. So, but yeah, but going back kind of a little bit, I will say that the other definition of quiet quitting, where people are willingly choosing to disengage while they're in the workplace, that actually concerns me quite a bit. And I would challenge anybody, if they're at that point, to actually like quit. And I know it's easier said than done. And it's not that, you could be completely in the right, and it's hard to leave when that happens, right? But the problem is that if it's that disengaging to you, you should probably start your job search. And what really concerns me when I hear that for some people, what's happened with the quiet quitting is that they're actually completely disengaging while at work or on the job is a couple things. I think the first is obvious is that you actually can hurt your reputation. I don't think anybody needs to be a superhero with a cape, but you should put in the effort during the hours that you're there. But here's the other thing that really concerns me, what a lot of people don't think about while they're going through this. A lot of people work in safety sensitive roles. You're
Yeah,
not engaged, you can get hurt, right? You can
absolutely.
really get hurt. And that really worries me when I hear about that. And there's probably a lot of people who do that and continue to go through the motions because a lot of um, fear of uncertainty, right, crops up because people, they know the job that they're in, they're afraid to go through the job search, they're afraid that if they don't get the first job that they apply for, that something bad has happened, or they just don't know what to do. There's many reasons why people don't search for jobs when they should. But and maybe this is just because I'm in Fort McMurray, Deb, and there's a lot of industry up here and a lot of safety sensitive roles. But I'll tell you, like that can lead to some really like fatal and mortal consequences if you are in the type of job that has that. And even if you're in a knowledge based job or a job that isn't as labor intensive, it can still crop up to be a safety issue because what happens is that you can't really separate work from home, right? And what'll end up happening is that your overall level of engagement, right, as far as just how cognizant you are of what's going on around you goes down. So you are at greater risk when you commute, for instance, to not fully be in the moment on the road. You are at greater risk when you're doing work around your house, right, to be in that place. And you could be doing safety sensitive work there. Or when you're with your family, right, you are at risk of not being fully in the moment with them because a lot of things that happen at work spill over into home or your personal life and vice versa, if we're being honest. And so when I hear that people are disengaged to the point where it extends past setting a healthy boundary and it extends past turning off the phone at the end of the day or not going on your emails all night or something like that, that worries me, especially in the safety sensitive role like that. And I hate to say it, but even before people were talking about quiet quitting, if you look at some workplace surveys, maybe like 80% of people don't really enjoy their jobs and they stay in them because they just think, well, it's work and it's called work for a reason. And it wasn't supposed to be something that engages me or fulfills me. It's work. That's not good. And that can have lots of dire consequences at work and at home, no matter what your job is. So that, anyway, I'm going on a little bit of a rant here, but that's something that around this quiet quitting phenomenon that does concern me. That goes beyond that boundary setting. So
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you on that. So
yeah,
that ability to stay focused and
yeah,
engaged is a
mhm,
tough thing. And I always say that you got to own it as the employee. If you are working for a company, you are disengaged, you are thinking of a home environment, you're thinking of other things and not being present. That is an issue that I don't believe is 100% the responsibility of the company. It's you as the employee. So, I mean, we control our own emotions, we control our mindset piece.
mhm,
And this is very much a mindset piece. It is about being curious, being interested in the job, making the job interesting if it tends to be rather routine and mundane.
yep,
But really, those safety first elements that really come into play. I mean, that was always drilled into me as a child. My
yeah,
dad, very because he was an outdoorsman, kind of one of the last sort of true bushmen.
yeah,
Um, he said he was always saying safety first, safety first, safety first. It was
yeah,
drilled into us of just stopping, being very present, and just scanning your environment and knowing like what is that list that I need to go through to check through that everything's being done
yeah.
before I take action. But it is really important from a mindset piece to be in that emotional state, the right emotional state
That's right.
first
Yeah,
before you take the action, which means that we need to be very present to go, okay, take a deep breath, home in. What am I doing? What do I, what kind of results do I want?
Yeah.
And then what is that emotional state that's going to support the action? Move into that emotional state first, being very present, the right emotional state to support what would be called inspired action. And so that piece becomes really important, is that we stay engaged as employees within a company. I mean, whether you run a business, um, as a business owner, as a part of a leadership team, or whether you're part of the team as a whole, being engaged and being present. You signed a contract when you came on as an employee in a company to work for a company. You signed a contract to perform, to do things to a certain standard. And there is a learning curve, there is a process that we go through on a continual basis,
Yeah.
depending,
Right.
if there's new things to learn.
Yeah.
But you have to stay committed to that process. And if you are no longer feeling that inner commitment, you have to check yourself. You've got to check your emotions, find a way to make the job more fun and more interesting, developing certain relationships and collaborating or holding each other accountable. But
Right.
you're quite right. It does get to a
Yeah.
point where you've got to make a decision and go, is this the right place for me? If
Mhm.
not, I need to step back and I need to leave.
Yeah, and you're so right, Deb. And I mean, I can't encourage people on here enough to be honest with themselves about that, because it's hard. But you only get to do, like, take away the safety element of it, right? Like, let's take the emotional and mental well-being piece of it. You only get to really have your career once,
Right.
right? You best do it in a way that, um, that how do I put it, brings you some level of fulfillment or engagement, right? Because it's like when you look back on things, do you want to say, man, like, I'm really happy I spent all that time in that role that didn't engage me? Probably not,
Yeah.
right? Probably not. So I think I just challenge everybody. It's scary for people, which is why so many people don't take the action they should take. But it just doesn't have to be that way. It just doesn't, and it shouldn't. Is my mindset. Easier said than done. I get it. There's a lot of action that goes with that, but I just can't encourage people enough to make the right decision for them and their families and their career. I just can't. It just makes a huge difference.
Which brings me to a really sort of an interesting segue to go into the quiet firing element, because
Right.
there's a few things we've got to discuss on there that I think are
Yes.
pretty interesting topics. But here you have an employee who is not engaged. It
Yeah.
isn't their environment that they really want to be in. They're just
Yeah.
not passionate about it. Rather than going through a formal termination process, sometimes it's just a simple conversation to go, what are you doing here? You're just not loving this environment. You're just not passionate about it. What is it that you are passionate about? What
Yeah.
is it that you're dreaming about? And they go, I really have dreamt about doing this or this. And
Yeah.
they go, well, then why aren't you pursuing your
Why aren't
dreams?
you doing it?
And
Yeah.
in that moment of the conversation, the light bulb goes off and they suddenly go, you're right, I need to be somewhere else.
Hmm.
And that can be all it takes in a conversation to encourage somebody to pursue their dreams, that
Totally.
it no longer you have to go through a disciplinary action process. Easier said than done. But the really caring employer who truly cares about their team members and wants them to fulfill their dreams and to pursue their passions, that can actually happen in a conversation in an environment where people go, you're right, I'd rather be somewhere else. In fact, that actually happened to me, not in exactly the same way. It was more of an internal dialogue where I was already starting a business and had the business on the side while working full time. But I reached a point where I couldn't concentrate on the paperwork and on the files, and realized I don't really want to be here. The passion isn't here anymore. And I knew in that moment that was the point to walk away. So
Totally.
that, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that I've heard around quiet firing as well is that it could also be a phenomenon where maybe a leader, manager, supervisor has decided that somebody and it often, I should clarify, it often happens subconsciously, which is why quiet firing ever happens, because people aren't thinking when they're doing things, and it's happening, right? They're not consciously aware of what's going on. But basically, um, what happens is that sometimes a leader might decide that it's time to move on from a situation, consciously or subconsciously, but they haven't spoken with that person about it, or they're disappointed with their performance, or they don't think it's where it needs to be. They're not speaking with that person about it. So what ends up happening is that they avoid that person, right? They avoid interactions and conversations with them. They accidentally get cut out of meetings or things, not because they're sitting there in their office thinking, how do I cut this person out? But they're just avoiding having to have the conversation, right? And that is another form of quiet firing that I've heard a fair amount about. And it's one of those things where, as leaders, it's not necessarily happening because anybody's looking to be malicious or evil. They're busy. And so you choose to spend your time where you can get the most out of it. But what ends up happening is that you end up avoiding the big issue. And over time, that can actually have a spillover effect in your team and create productivity problems for everybody that will compound that busyness problem that the leader has, right? And so I've heard both kind of sides of the quiet firing phenomenon. And I would always encourage leaders. It's the same as when it's the other way around. When you know you need to do something, it's scary to do, but you got to do it. Because when you don't, every day, that decision compounds with interest. And I always say, when it comes to anything in life, you can pay now or you can pay later. If you pay later, it's with interest. So you pick, right? And that, if you have somebody that you need to move on from in your team, people can see that and they can sense it if you're not taking action where you need to. They can sense it if you're not being upfront with that person. And it does affect the productivity around them. And it actually exasperates your problem in the end. So you have to have the conversation you need to have.
I
Right?
agree. And I
Yeah.
have seen that a lot in organizations where it comes to developing the supervisor role, the manager role, where they don't like conflict and they don't want to have the conversation, and they also don't want to document the disciplinary action.
That's right.
They think I'm only in here for a temporary period of time. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move into another section. I'm going to get promoted. I'll leave it for the next supervisor and manager to deal with. And so I see that quite frequently. It does not get documented. So what should have been documented a year, 6 months ago, 2 years ago, as an ongoing process to support the disciplinary action process doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And that is an issue from a mindset point of view of a lack of a desire to want to have a meaningful conversation, wanting to influence and inspire people to do better, but also wanting to sit there in a conversation that could result in conflict. They have to be willing to do that. That is a mindset piece that they've got to be willing to do it. So I do want to chat about another aspect of the quiet firing where the senior managers don't communicate with staff in general. All of a sudden, somebody just disappears and they're no longer there. And the staff, their heads on a swivel going, what happened to that person in finance? Like, where did they go? And then the rumor mill starts and somebody says, I heard they were let go. And then the employees become incredibly nervous, and then productivity just plummets. It goes down. And with this problem, what I'm seeing is the staff, the general staff, team members do not know the policy, the procedures, the legislation. What is the process to take people through a disciplinary action moving towards a termination? I mean, there's always grounds for immediate termination, things like assault and theft and
for sure,
in extreme insubordination, willful insubordination, those sorts of things.
Right.
But there are times when there's a series of disciplinary actions that are taken quietly behind the scenes, but nobody really knows what that process is. So therefore, they're thinking, "Am I the target next? Am I going to get fired next?"
Yeah.
So that nervousness is preventing them from focusing on their work and their productivity. So the leadership team needs to be very much aware to say that needs to be an upfront conversation. an upfront document that needs to be provided to the staff to say, here's the reasons for termination. Here's the process that we typically go through. Here is where we can do an immediate termination. These are the causes for immediate termination. So look, if you haven't done any of those things and you haven't received any kind of disciplinary action, you're not going to be next. So relax, go back to work. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, a few things come to mind. I've worked with countless leaders, right? That when they make a decision to move on from somebody, it doesn't get announced, right? And they'll come up with reasons like, and at the end of the day, I hate to be really blunt and almost aggressive in my language, but it's an excuse.
Yeah.
And they come up with the excuse that if people know that somebody was let go, then it will just destroy morale. Really? What will destroy morale is when people aren't considered adults, right? And they're not allowed to know what's going on in the workplace. They're not allowed to know that this person isn't here anymore. And then they're trying to get their help and they're embarrassed when a project drops dead because nobody knew that you weren't supposed to deal with that person anymore. Or like it's super ineffective, and it displays a lack of courage and a lack of courageous authenticity as a leader to to not be upfront with your team about who's coming and going.
Lack of trust as well.
Yeah, lack of trust.
Creates an atmosphere of a lack of trust. So people are going, what's going on? Am I next? Who's next?
Exactly. And it's like, and how do you create chaos in your workplace? Simple. Don't tell people what's happening inside of it. Like it's not. So anyway, it's actually like one of my, I'm glad you brought it up because I try not to live my life with pet peeves, but that's definitely one of them. And I've worked in places before where people just were not upfront with people. And it hurt. Like it hurt them a lot. It hurt their credibility. It hurt the workplace. Let's talk about what's going to hurt morale, right?
Yeah.
You got to communicate with people. And even on when you're what you'd mentioned as well around documenting conversations and stuff like that and expectations, you can tell who does it and you can tell who doesn't. And again, you pay now or you pay later, right?
Yeah, I think more than anything, employees, leaders and employees want a sense of security in the workplace environment. Trust, like you said, trust, authenticity, that assurance that things are going to move forward. The right people are going to be there. They can count on their team members, count on their leaders in an organization to move the company forward. So, I mean, listen, we always talk about the philosophy. My philosophy is everything we acquire is with and through other people. That's how things get done in an organization. But it has to be done with the highest level of respect.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're not doing it to be angry or mean or demeaning to people. You're doing it to be upfront with them. How can people succeed if you're not upfront with them?
Yeah, and we're talking about this important topic of quiet quitting and quiet firing. This is for you as an employer, as a business leader, to ensure that we have uninterrupted operations in a business and the business is fulfilling its obligation to vendors, suppliers, the clients, the community. I mean, it is ultimately what business is all about. It's about providing value, and that highest value is created in an environment of trust and deep respect and authenticity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Any last comments here before we're finishing
No,
off?
I was just thinking to myself, like, what better way to close it? Because that's the lesson, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is the lesson. But such a great topic. And I'm really looking forward to our next segment together, Tim. So for our audience, our segment of recruit, hire, and lead to retain, we'll see you next time.
See everybody.